Hello, in this lesson we will be setting up RBAC for kubelet authorization. So what is RBAC? Well, RBAC stands for Role-Based Access Control. And it's just the mechanism that we use in Kubernetes to create roles and assign permissions to different users. It's basically the way that we typically do authorization within Kubernetes. However, when we're setting up Kubernetes from scratch, like we are in this course, we need to make sure that the Kubernetes API has permission to access the kubelet API on each node and perform certain common tasks. If we don't do this, some functionality won't work because the permissions that are necessary for it to work won't be in place. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a cluster role with the necessary permissions, and we're going to assign that role to the Kubernetes user with a cluster role binding. If you're not intimately familiar with the way role-based access control works in Kubernetes, that's fine. I'll provide you with the commands and I'll kind of guide you through what we're doing as we proceed. So here I am logged into my two Kubernetes control nodes. And up to this point, we've been doing a lot of steps that require us to run commands on both servers. But at this point, we only need to run the commands in this lesson on one of the servers. It's actually not going to break anything or mess anything up if you run it on both, but we only need to run these commands on one server because what we're going to be doing is we're now communicating with the Kubernetes cluster itself through the Kubernetes API to create objects, and those changes are going to propagate across the entire cluster. So I'm going to go ahead and run this first command. And as always, you can find it in the description below the video. And what I'm doing is I'm doing a kubectl apply. And I'm using this cat EOF here to basically pass in this content to the kubectl apply command. So we're doing a kubectl apply -f, which allows us to pass in the contents of a file, but instead of passing in the file, we're actually just passing in this content right here. And of course, we're specifying our kubeconfig to allow us to authenticate. So what we're doing is we're creating a cluster role. And there's some various information that's being set up here. This is going to be the name of our cluster role that we're creating, various labels and annotations. And we're basically giving that cluster role certain access permissions. And these are the permissions that are going to be needed in order for some of the features to work. So we're giving permission to this user to be able to access certain functionality within the kubelet API. So I'm going to go ahead and run that command. And it says that my cluster role was successfully created right here. So now I'm going to run a second command. And we've created the cluster role. So what we need to do now is we need to assign that cluster role to a user. And we're actually just going to assign it to the default Kubernetes user. So we are specifying the cluster role, which we just created right here. And here's where we're specifying the user that we're assigning that role to. So that's all I need to do in order to set up the role-based access control for kubelet authorization. It's actually fairly simple and straightforward, just these two commands, creating a cluster role and then a cluster role binding to bind that role to a user. Later on, when we have our Kubernetes cluster fully set up and we go to get the logs from a pod, we'll be able to do so because the appropriate permissions are now in place.